What in God's name is going on here? Jonathan Whitmore's voice sliced through the gentle melody like a cold blade. He stood rigid in the doorway of his daughter's sunlit nursery, eyes locked on the unbelievable sight before him. Clara, his 8-year-old daughter, who hadn't spoken a word in 3 years, sat at the grand piano beside Lorraine Carter, her new nanny, singing a flawless French lullaby. For a moment, the world felt suspended. The soft notes, the child's clear voice. These things were impossible. Clara's lips moved with delicate precision, her bright blue eyes fixed on the sheet music, as if she had been doing this all her life. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat, replaced almost instantly by a surge of anger. "Stop this right now!" he barked, striding into the room. Clara's hands froze mid-note, her shoulders tensing. Lorraine rose slowly from the bench, her calm expression meeting his fury. "Mr. Whitmore, I can explain—" "Explain?" His tone dripped with disbelief. "Explain how my mute daughter suddenly performs like a trained musician when the finest specialist in Manhattan told me she may never speak again?" Clara's gaze dropped to her lap. She shrank back as if the sunlight itself had turned harsh. Lorraine placed a steadying hand on the girl's shoulder, but Jonathan's voice pressed on, sharp and relentless. Inside, something unspoken flickered, a blend of shock, fear, and perhaps a sliver of hope he refused to acknowledge. Because if Clara could sing, then everything he had believed for 3 years might have been a lie. What if the silence he had accepted wasn't the truth at all? If your child had stayed silent for years, how would you react the moment you heard their voice again? Jonathan's chest tightened as the last echoes of the song faded into the air. Lorraine stood her ground, her hands still resting gently on Clara's shoulder, as though shielding her from the storm brewing in the room. "Mr. Whitmore," she began, her voice calm but firm, "your daughter has always been able to speak. She simply chooses when and with whom." Jonathan let out a short, humorless laugh. "She's 8 years old and practically mute. Do you have any idea how absurd you sound? I've spent hundreds of thousands on neurologists, speech therapists, behavioral specialists. Every report says the same thing: selective mutism with severe cognitive delays." Lorraine's eyes didn't flinch. "And every one of those reports was written by someone who never truly listened to her. Clara tells me stories every day about the books she's read, the dreams she's had, even about you. She speaks English, French, and Italian. She plays the piano and violin, and she's teaching herself guitar. You see limitations because you've been told to look for them. I see a child who is brimming with life." Jonathan's brows knitted into a scowl, though a tiny crack formed in his armor. Clara shifted in her seat, her small hands twisting the hem of her dress. "Enough!" Jonathan snapped, as if silencing the rising discomfort in his own mind. "I don't need parenting advice from a nanny with no medical training." Lorraine's voice lowered, but the conviction sharpened. "I'm not here to replace doctors. I'm here to understand Clara. That's something no one in this house, not even you, has done in years." Clara's head lifted ever so slightly, her eyes darting between the two adults. "Daddy," she whispered, and the single word was like glass shattering in the silence. Jonathan froze. She hadn't called him that in years. "I talk," Clara continued, her voice trembling but clear. "I just don't talk to people who don't want to listen." The room contracted around that one sentence. Jonathan felt the weight of it like a blow to the chest. Lorraine's lips curved into the faintest smile, not of victory, but of vindication. "She has been waiting for you to hear her, Mr. Whitmore. Not the words from her mouth, but the ones from her heart." Jonathan turned his face away, as if avoiding the truth could make it disappear. "You've manipulated her somehow," he muttered, though his tone had lost some of its bite. Clara slid off the piano bench and stood next to Lorraine, her small frame straightening with surprising courage. "She listens to me," Clara said softly. "She doesn't ask what's wrong with me. She asks what I think." Jonathan stared at his daughter as if seeing her for the first time in years. But the part of him that feared losing control refused to yield. "This conversation is over," he said curtly, retreating into the safety of his authority. Lorraine's gaze followed him, steady and unafraid. She had planted a seed, and she knew seeds had a way of growing, even in the coldest soil. Jonathan's jaw was set like stone, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something unsettled. Clara's small voice still echoed in his mind, an unwelcome truth pressing against years of certainty. He stepped closer, his towering frame casting a shadow over the piano. "Pack your things, Lorraine. You're done here." Clara's head snapped toward him, panic flaring in her eyes. "No!" Her voice cracked, raw with desperation. She darted forward and wrapped her arms tightly around Lorraine's waist. "She can't leave. She's the only one who understands me." Jonathan's face hardened. "Enough, Clara." He reached for her arm, but she clung tighter to Lorraine, her tiny fingers digging into the fabric of her dress, as if letting go would mean losing her voice forever. "Mr. Whitmore," Lorraine began, her tone level but edged with steel. "You're making a mistake. She's finally opening up, and you're shutting the door on her again." He ignored her, focusing instead on peeling Clara away. "You filled her head with ideas," he said through clenched teeth. "I won't let you undo years of professional work." "Years of professional work," Lorraine countered. That kept her silent. That hit harder than he wanted to admit, so he turned it into anger. In one swift motion, he lifted Clara into his arms, despite her kicking and crying. "Maria!" he called, his voice reverberating down the hall. The housekeeper appeared, startled by the scene. "Take Clara to her room. Lock the door." "No, Daddy!" Clara screamed, her small hands reaching back for Lorraine. "Don't leave me. Please don't leave me." Her cries followed them down the hall, each sob slicing into Lorraine's chest. She stood frozen, the echo of that locked door sealing more than just a bedroom. It sealed a fragile trust that had just begun to bloom. Jonathan returned, his breathing heavy, but his composure forcibly reassembled. "You have 10 minutes to leave, or I'll have security escort you off the property." Lorraine's gaze didn't falter. "Before I go," she said quietly, "you need to see what your daughter is truly capable of." Jonathan waved her off, unwilling to entertain another word. But she saw it, just for a moment, the uncertainty in his eyes. She knew she had struck a chord, whether he admitted it or not. Gathering her coat and bag, Lorraine paused at the threshold. "One day," she said softly, "you'll wish you had listened." And with that, she stepped out into the cold Manhattan air, leaving behind a girl whose voice had only just begun to rise, and a father too afraid to hear it. The front gates of the Whitmore estate closed behind Lorraine with a low metallic groan, but she didn't leave right away. She stood on the sidewalk, the wind whipping her coat around her legs, letting the sting of Clara's cries sink into her bones. Inside her bag, hidden beneath a scarf, was the small black digital recorder that had captured the truth Jonathan refused to see. Over the past 2 months, she had recorded hours of conversations, not out of malice, but to document the astonishing intellect of a little girl the world thought was broken. Clara reciting poetry in French, playing entire piano concertos from memory, explaining the constellations she had learned from an astronomy book. And there was more. Her quiet confessions about feeling invisible in her own home, about pretending to be less so her father would pay attention. Lorraine knew she wasn't leaving empty-handed. She was leaving with the only weapon that mattered, the truth. Back inside, Jonathan paced his study, jaw tight. Something about the way Lorraine had looked at him unsettled him. It wasn't defiance, it was certainty, and certainty was dangerous. He called his attorney, speaking in curt, clipped sentences about breach of trust and unauthorized recordings. But even as he spoke, her words came back to him. "You'll wish you had listened." He shook them off, burying himself in financial reports, convincing himself this was just another employee who had overstepped. Lorraine, meanwhile, walked a short distance to her small apartment in the Upper West Side. She tossed her bag onto the couch and pulled out the recorder, placing it gently on the table like a sacred relic. She had already backed up every file onto a secure drive, labeling the folder Project Clara. It wasn't just about saving a little girl anymore. It was about exposing a pattern she had seen too many times in wealthy families. A child's spirit stifled to maintain a perfect public image. That evening, she called Samuel Green, an attorney known not only for his legal skill, but for his commitment to children's rights. "It's time," she told him. "I have the documentation, the audio, and witnesses. But this can't just be a lawsuit. I want this to change Clara's life permanently." Samuel listened, occasionally interrupting with questions about dates and details. When she mentioned Dr. Emily Hawthorne, her mentor and one of the nation's most respected child psychologists, his tone sharpened. If Dr. Hawthorne can verify this, we're looking at more than a legal case. We're talking about a public reckoning. 2 days later, Lorraine sat across from Dr. Hawthorne in her book-lined office, the soft scent of lavender tea filling the air. She pressed play on the recorder. Clara's voice, delicate yet confident, filled the room. A flawless recitation of a Shakespeare sonnet in English, followed by an impromptu explanation of its meaning. Then a soft giggle, a song in Italian, and finally the quiet heartbreak of her saying, "Daddy never hears me. He hears about me." Dr. Hawthorne's brow furrowed with each passing minute. "Lorraine, this is extraordinary. This child is a linguistic prodigy, but she's surviving in survival mode, hiding her gifts to protect herself emotionally." Meanwhile, at the Whitmore mansion, a new figure entered the picture. Eleanor Briggs, the British nanny Jonathan had hired through an elite agency. She arrived with impeccable references, but also with eyes that missed nothing. Within her first day, she noticed Clara's refusal to speak, the way the child's gaze drifted toward the door, as if waiting for someone who would never return. Jonathan assured her this was normal for Clara, but Eleanor had cared for dozens of children and knew when something was wrong. That night, while clearing the dinner table, Eleanor found a folded note under Clara's untouched plate. In neat, deliberate handwriting, it read, "Is Lorraine coming back?" Eleanor's hand tightened around the paper. Something in her gut told her this wasn't the first cry for help that had gone unanswered. Far across town, Lorraine typed the final entry into Project Clara, her fingers steady despite the storm she knew she was about to unleash. This was no longer a question of whether Jonathan Whitmore would listen. It was about making sure the world did. Eleanor Briggs had been in the Whitmore household less than a week when she realized the glossy veneer of wealth hid something far uglier beneath. Jonathan's instructions were clear. Keep Clara on a strict schedule, avoid stimulating activities that might agitate her, and under no circumstances discuss the previous nanny. The rules alone raised red flags, but Eleanor had learned in her 40 years of childcare that the unspoken rules were the most telling. And here the unspoken rule was silence. On the third evening, Eleanor found Clara sitting cross-legged on her bed, a blank sketchbook in her lap. "Would you like me to read to you?" Eleanor asked softly. Clara didn't answer, but her eyes flicked toward the door, as if measuring the distance to escape. Eleanor sat anyway, opening the book to a page where she began reading in a calm, measured voice. Halfway through, Clara slid a folded piece of paper toward her. In careful handwriting, it read, "Do you know where Lorraine is?" The question struck Eleanor like a dart to the heart. She didn't know Lorraine, but she knew what it meant for a child to latch onto someone who made them feel safe. "I don't," she said honestly, "but maybe you can tell me about her?" Clara's lips didn't move, but her eyes softened just enough to suggest trust could grow here. Later that night, as Eleanor prepared for bed, her phone buzzed with an unknown number. The message was short. "Hello, Mrs. Briggs. I'm Lorraine Carter, Clara's former nanny. I believe you've noticed something unusual in the family dynamic. If you're willing, I'd like to speak with you about how we can help her." Eleanor stared at the screen, debating the risk. She had signed a confidentiality agreement. Jonathan's agency was strict about discretion. But then she thought of Clara's note, the weight of longing in those small letters, and replied, "Tell me everything." The next day, Eleanor found ways to observe without being obvious. She noticed how Clara perked up at the sound of the piano in the parlor, only to retreat when Jonathan entered the room. She saw how meal times were tense. Jonathan speaking over his daughter to the housekeeper about business or charity galas, never to Clara herself, and she began to understand that the girl's silence wasn't a void. It was a shield. That evening, Eleanor called Lorraine from her parked car, speaking in hushed tones. Lorraine outlined the recordings, the observations, the plan she called Project Clara. She spoke not like an accuser, but like a protector, driven less by anger at Jonathan and more by determination to free the child from the invisible chains around her. "He doesn't see her," Lorraine said. "Not really. He sees a flaw to be fixed, not a mind to be nurtured. But with the right people in the right moment, we can show him and the world exactly who she is. Eleanor listened, feeling a mix of admiration and apprehension. "And what happens to me if he finds out I'm involved?" she asked. "You'll have to decide if that's a risk worth taking," Lorraine replied. "But I think you already know." The following morning, Clara handed Eleanor another note. This one was more direct. "If you talk to Lorraine, tell her I'm still learning the new song." Eleanor folded the paper carefully, tucking it into her pocket like a secret pact. She knew then that she wasn't just a bystander. She was part of something bigger. That night, in the quiet of her small apartment over the garage, Eleanor sat down with a notebook and began her own record. She wrote about Clara's subtle signs of engagement, how she would tap her fingers to an unheard rhythm, or the way her eyes brightened when a question was asked instead of an order given. She wrote about Jonathan, too, the dismissive remarks, the impatience, the way he seemed more concerned with controlling appearances than connecting with his daughter. When she finished, she sent a single text to Lorraine: "I'm in." Across the city, Lorraine received the message with a grim smile. Project Clara now had an insider. And with Eleanor's eyes and ears inside the Whitmore mansion, the truth was one step closer to breaking free. The morning of the conference was crisp and bright, but to Jonathan Whitmore, the light streaming through his office windows felt harsh, invasive. He had barely touched his breakfast when his phone buzzed with a message that made his stomach lurch. "Press conference today, 3 p.m., Columbia University Children's Rights Center. Your presence is recommended. OKR, LC." He didn't need to guess who LC was. By early afternoon, Jonathan sat in the back of a crowded auditorium, his tailored suit immaculate, his expression a mask of control. At the podium stood Dr. Emily Hawthorne, flanked by Samuel Green and, Jonathan's jaw tightened, Lorraine Carter. Behind them, a large screen displayed the title, "Hidden in Silence, The Gifted Child You Never See." Dr. Hawthorne began without preamble. "For the past 2 months, I've been reviewing documentation of an extraordinary child, a girl whose abilities were overlooked because of a single, powerful misconception that she was broken." She pressed a button and the first audio clip played. Clara's voice, pure and melodic, filled the auditorium as she sang an entire aria in flawless Italian. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Jonathan shifted uncomfortably as clip after clip revealed a different facet of his daughter's brilliance, discussing constellations, solving complex math problems, explaining the emotional themes of a Chopin nocturne. But then came the recording that made his throat tighten. Clara's small, steady voice saying, "Daddy never hears me. He hears about me." The audience was silent, the weight of the words sinking into every corner of the room. Jonathan clenched his fists in his lap, a bead of sweat forming at his temple. Samuel Green took the microphone. "This case is not about condemning a parent, but about confronting how societal biases, and yes, parental pride, can blind us to what is right before our eyes." Lorraine stepped forward, holding a folder thick with papers and photographs. "These are Clara's compositions, her drawings, her stories," she said, her voice even. None of this was nurtured by expensive specialists. All of it emerged when she was listened to. Jonathan wanted to speak, to defend himself, but his tongue felt heavy. Every defense that formed in his mind dissolved under the quiet conviction in Lorraine's words. And then Eleanor Briggs appeared at the side of the stage, holding a simple note in her hand. She approached the microphone and read, "Is Lorraine coming back?" The handwriting was unmistakably Clara's. The image flashed on the screen, a photograph of the note Eleanor had kept. Gasps echoed through the room. Eleanor spoke softly into the microphone. "In my 40 years of childcare, I've never seen a child's longing for connection so clearly written in so few words." Dr. Hawthorne delivered the final blow. "Clara Whitmore has no cognitive impairments. Her selective mutism is a response to emotional neglect. She is fluent in multiple languages, a gifted musician, and a creative thinker far beyond her years. She does not need to be fixed. She needs to be seen." The room erupted in applause, but to Jonathan the sound was deafening in a different way. It was the sound of a truth he could no longer control. Samuel Green turned to him from the stage. "Mr. Whitmore, we invite you to join us, not to save face, but to start anew as the father Clara deserves. Jonathan remained seated, his eyes locked on Lorraine. She didn't smirk or gloat. She simply looked back at him with the steady gaze of someone who had kept a promise to a child, no matter the cost. In that moment, he realized the battle he'd been fighting wasn't against Lorraine or the so-called experts. It was against the truth of his own fear. As the conference drew to a close, Jonathan rose slowly, aware of the cameras turning toward him. He didn't know what he would say yet, but for the first time he knew what he needed to do. Listen. 6 months later, the Columbia University auditorium was filled once again, but this time for a celebration. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting a warm glow on the stage where Clara Whitmore stood, a Medal of Honor draped around her neck. The announcer listed her accomplishments: fluent in 5 languages, composer of 3 original musical pieces, and recipient of the Young Scholars Award for Academic Excellence. From the front row, Jonathan watched with a mixture of awe and humility. The tailored perfection of his suit no longer felt like armor. Today it was simply attire for a proud father. When Clara stepped down from the stage, she walked straight to him. "Daddy," she whispered, her eyes bright. "Are you proud of me now?" Jonathan's throat tightened as he knelt to her level. "I've always been proud of you, Clara. I just had to learn how to see it." He pulled her into a hug, and for the first time he meant every word. Lorraine stood at that side of the room, a quiet smile on her face. She had refused public credit beyond what was necessary. To her, the real victory was the scene unfolding now. A father who finally looked at his daughter and saw not a problem to be solved, but a gift to be cherished. Eleanor Briggs stood beside Lorraine, her hands clasped in front of her. "You did it," she murmured. Lorraine shook her head. "No, Clara did it. We just gave her the space to shine." After the ceremony, Jonathan approached Lorraine. "I owe you more than an apology," he said quietly. "I owe you my gratitude, and my promise that I will never stop listening." Lorraine nodded. "Keep that promise, Jonathan. She'll take you further than you've ever imagined." Clara, now surrounded by classmates from the gifted program, laughed freely, her voice carrying across the courtyard. It was a sound no one would ever take for granted again. If you had the power to help a child unlock their true potential, would you take the risk, no matter what it cost you?